Hello and welcome everyone to our second lecture in the series on the magical seals of King Solomon. In our previous lecture, we sketched the broader story, how Solomon's famed wisdom, and with it his magical ring and seal, migrated from late antique legend into the heart of the medieval imagination. Over time, this figure of the wise king was transformed into a cross-cultural symbol of authority invoked by magicians, theologians, and storytellers alike. Today, we remain in Europe, but shifts our focus to a more specific period, the late medieval and early modern eras. Here, we will examine the transformation or overlap of Solomon's seals with the pentaculum or pentacle, figures that are commonly found in magical handbooks. We'll explore its debated etymologies and unpack how it functioned not only as a protective amulet, but also as an instrument in demon summoning rituals, that is, necromancy. The stories surrounding Solomon and his seal did not remain confined to text. As we have seen, they quickly spilled into the material world, especially in the form of amulets. Already in late antiquity, we find physical objects that draw on these traditions for magical use. In the previous lecture, we looked at how Solomon's name and seal appeared in verbal charms or spells. But these formulas rarely told us what the seal actually looked like or what material it was made from. Instead, we are left to examine the many artifacts that claim to represent it: magical gems, pendants, medallions, and the like. Take, for instance, a now lost gemstone that was sketched by an antiquarian in the 17th century. The drawing shows an object inscribed with the words "Seal of Solomon," marked by a star and a series of zigzag or Z-shaped lines, features that scholars interpret as visual stands-in for the seal. Whoever once carried this gem likely believed it had protective power, a tangible manifestation of Solomon's magical authority. And this is just one example among many. But today, we are here to discuss a much later and more specific development, the pentaculum, a term that emerged in the late Middle Ages and, at times, overlaps with the idea of the Seal of Solomon. The English word pentacle, derived from the Latin pentaculum, typically refers to magical medallions mentioned in the clavicula Solomonis, or the little key of Solomon. This influential manual of magic appeared in Europe around the 14th century. Unlike many other magical treatises, it did not claim to introduce a new method or an original magical system. Instead, it offered a practical response to the overwhelming number of magical recipes circulating at that time. By grouping these procedures, standardizing the magical diagrams, and prescribing a fixed structure, the clavicula provided practicing magicians with an orderly framework. Its goal was not innovation, but usability. Importantly, the clavicula presents itself explicitly as a manual for coercing demons. Its instructions direct the practitioner to summon, bind, interrogate, and dismiss various demon kings and their legions, always under threat of divine names and magical diagrams. For its systematic approach, it was regarded by its scribes as the most important manual of magic and quickly acquired iconic status among magicians. Unsurprisingly, this prominence contributed to its notoriety and frequent inclusion in church lists of forbidden books. In the clavicula, the pentacles are medallions that were presented to summon demons to compel them to obey the practitioner, a common motif in demonic magic. The etymology of the word pentaculum is uncertain, and several speculations concerning it have been attested since the early modern period. Some have linked it to Greek roots, such as penta of pentaculum, penta is 5, or even pan, all, everything. Others, like the 19th-century lexicographer Frédéric Godefroy, proposed a more folk-inspired explanation. In his Dictionary of the Old French Language and all its dialects, he suggested that the French pentacle derived from pentacle, meaning hangs from the neck, highlighting its pendant-like form and function. Treating pentacles as objects worn around the neck was by no means a novel interpretation. Jewish authors, too, encountered the term and thought to translate it into their own linguistic and cultural framework. One such figure was the Italian physician and linguist David ben Yitzhak de Pomis, who in his well-known trilingual dictionary glossed the term both in Latin and Italian. Breve, pentaculum is breve, that is, worn around the neck. For the Italian Dominican friar and philologist Sant'Espanino, pentaculi and breve, that is, textual amulet, are synonyms. He even linked them to the Talmudic term galtore, which was sometimes seen as related to magic. Beginning in the 15th century and continuing well beyond, lexicographical sources, regardless of their author's direct involvement with magical literature, consistently defined the pentacle as a small object typically worn around the neck, inscribed with recognizable or cryptic letters, and believed to possess apotropaic power. Things become a bit more complicated when we consider that the term pentacles, or the Italian pentaculi, shares its history with another technical term from learned magical literature, that is, kandari, which we encountered in the previous lecture. The two are closely linked, as we can see in the Clavicula Solomonis, where kandari are explicitly identified as pentacles. In one of the earliest known versions of the Clavicula, an Italian manuscript translated from a now lost Latin original and published just a few years ago in a fantastic edition, and you can see it here, we come across an instruction to use kandari during the ritual to protect the practitioner. They are also mentioned in verbal formulas, where they serve as symbols of power. One such formula reads, and I quote, "And by the 9 celestial kandari, revealed in this manner to him, King Solomon, for the protection of his body." Later, these kandari are explicitly identified as pentacles, as we will see. This overlap between kandari and pentacles didn't go unnoticed outside the narrow circles of ritual magicians. In his dictionary, Frédéric Godefroy distinguishes pentacle from pentacle, defining the former as a 5-branched chandelier, drawing on the Greek penta, 5, and the French translation of Ludovico Ariosto's Il Nigromante as his source. The confusion begins to make sense once we recall the Clavicula's gloss. An Italian reader encountering the unfamiliar term kandari could easily misread or reinterpret it as candelabra, that is, chandelier, imagining a branch lamp rather than a magical medallion. That mental image, transported into the comedy Il Nigromante, reflects how far the term had drifted from its original context. This curious case is more than a lexical oddity. It shows that the ambiguity surrounding these magical terms wasn't confined to practitioners of ritual magic. The language of learned magic seeped into dictionaries and common usage, giving rise to hybrid meanings that modern scholars must now sort out carefully and historically. If the Clavicula Solomonis was regarded by its authors and scribes as the most important manual of magic, then the pentacles were clearly treated as the heart of that manual, its centerpiece and perhaps its most original contribution. This sentiment is made explicit in one striking declaration, and I quote from the earliest clavicula. This chapter on the pentacles, or in fact kandari, consists all the science of the clavicula. In other words, the entire body of magical knowledge contained in the manual was thought to culminate in this small collection of magical figures. This phrasing suggests a deliberate identification of the pentacles with the older term kandari, rather than a claim of superiority or authenticity. The authors are not proposing that these pentacles are the true or real kandari, only that for the purpose of this manual they are the same. In fact, some Latin manuscripts use the phrase pentacles or kandari in a similarly non-hierarchical way. In other words, Clavicula Solomonis doesn't claim to sort out which kandari are correct or original. Rather, it presents a particular set of ritual figures under the heading of pentacles, affirming their equivalence with the older kandaria. This move aligns perfectly with the broader goal of the manual: to organize, standardize, and render workable a vast and varied magical traditions for practical use. Interestingly, while the clavicula tends to equate kandari with pentacles, it also offers hints that the two could sometimes be distinguished, though not in a strict or a consistent way. One passage, for instance, remarks, and I quote, "This other pentacle or pentacle, placed below with those four kandari as great virtue." Here, the pentacle is treated as something that works in combination with four surrounding kandari, implying a layered or complementary relationship rather than simple equivalence. This distinction becomes more tangible when we look at the visual layout. The central pentacle appears as a more elaborate construction. It's a circular diagram composed of multiple concentric rings filled with magical characters, Latin texts, and geometric motifs. At its center sits a prominent cross surrounded by symbolic figures and divine names. Around this central motif are several smaller circles, each echoing the form of the surrounding four kandari, some unfinished, all arranged with deliberate symmetry. The four outer kandari, while also circular and inscribed with text, differ from the pentacle in both form and content. Their outer ring bear coherent Latin sentences, not just divine names, and each assigns a specific power or function to the figure it encircles. This suggests that the kandari retain their older, more flexible use as a multifunctional magical devices, tools that could be adapted to various needs depending on the inscription. For example, the kandari positioned in the lower right is meant to serve as a protective charm against fear and terror, as indicated by the inscription along its outer band. And I quote, "This name saves from fear and terror." Unlike the more elaborate central pentacle, which coordinates and combines multiple elements, each kandari seemed to preserve a more focused, purpose-driven use, carrying specific inscriptions that define its power. What we see here, then, is not a firm separation between kandari and pentacles, but rather a moment of differentiation within a shared conceptual space. The pentacle takes on a central role, while the kandari around it preserves an older model of magical use. As we'll see, this arrangement echoes a tradition that stretches back at least 2 centuries, highlighting the long and layered legacy of the kandari within the history of ritual magic. Examining the role of these pentacles and kandari in the ritual designed by the authors of the clavicula can also be useful for understanding how these objects were perceived by the designers and users. Since the clavicula functioned as a practical handbook, an auxiliary manual focused primarily on the art of summoning and coercing demons, the pentacles are not merely decorative or symbolic. They serve a specific, active role within the structured ritual. At the height of the ritual and as part of a conjuration, the magician is instructed to place his hands over the pentacles and proclaim, and I quote, "Here are the signs and names of the Creator, which you, the demons, always fear. Therefore, obey me for the sake of these most secret secrets." The gestures of flying hands upon the pentacles make it clear that these are the very objects being invoked in the spoken formula. They contain the signs and names of the Creator, the sacred and potent elements that compel obedience from demons. This is confirmed later in the text, where the scribe directly equates the signs with the pentacles themselves. In this context, the pentacles are not abstract representations of power. They are power, manifested through sacred names and magical figures. They function as the operative core of the ritual, making visible and tangible the divine authority that forces the demons to appear and comply. Since the pentacle seems to overlap with kandari, at least for the 15th century authors of the clavicula, it's helpful to look back and trace the earlier history of the word kandari to see when these two terms began to be treated as interchangeable. The word kandari shows up in several medieval dictionaries and was already known by the early 13th century. One of the earliest mentions comes from William of Oven, Bishop of Paris, who listed the kandari among various magical objects he condemned. According to William, the 9 kandari represented a form of idolatry, alongside other problematic items like the 4 rings of Solomon and the sigillum Solomonis, that is, the seal of Solomon. By placing the kandari alongside explicitly Solomonic instruments, William draws them into the same conceptual orbit. From his perspective, they form part of a broader category of illicit magical tools associated with Solomon and are equally condemned for their perceived spiritual danger. This early mention already hints at the merging of kandari with Solomonic objects, a fusion that later authors, especially those of the Clavicula Solomonis, would make more explicit. But what about the pentaculum or pentacles? Well, although the bishop does not mention a pentaculum among the magical or idolatrous objects he condemns, it does discuss something called the pentagonus, or pentagon of Solomon, but in a very different context. He notes that people attributed divinity to this pentagonus, which those people, call Solomon's, purely because of its geometric form, its 5 angles and shapes. William's concern here is about mistaken beliefs tied to geometry. In true scholastic fashion, he turns to Aristotle and Euclid to argue that no geometric figure, however perfect or complex, can possess divinity in itself. According to William, figures like the pentagonus cannot do anything on their own. If they appear to function magically, it is only through the use of signa, signs, that operate on the basis of mutual agreement. It's in this context that he brings in the more obviously magical Solomonic objects, the rings, the seal, and the kandari. These, he argues, are marked with signs that form a kind of pacto, with demons. Drawing on the Augustinian critique of magic as something possible only through a demonic pact, William concludes that those who use such objects are idolaters. What emerges from this is a sharp contrast. The kandari, though not yet called pentacles, are clearly labeled as magical tools used by heretics, objects inscribed with cryptic symbols meant to establish contact with demons or spirits. The pentagonus, by contrast, is treated purely as a geometric shape, potentially misleading in its elegance, but not inherently magical. That William separates the pentagonus from the Solomonic items he accuses of enabling demonic pacts suggests he did not equate it with the kandari. While the pentagonus may, in later tradition, be one of the sources that fed into the development of the pentacles, for William it remained the 5-angled polygon, an example of how geometry could be wrongly elevated to divine status, but not itself a magical instrument unless magical signs are involved. The Christian magician Berengar Ganell, author of the Summa Sacra Magica, that is the Summa of the Sacred Magic, is, at least for now, the earliest known practitioner whose writings include detailed discussions of the kandari. In his work, these are described as circular seals, each marked with unique symbols built from linear and angular forms. But while they may echo the geometry of the pentagonus, they go far beyond it. Ganell's kandari are composed of intersecting straight lines, arcs, crosses, and sometimes additional decorative elements such as dots or small circles. Each design is neatly centered within 2 concentric rings, and their complexity ranges from simple crosses to more intricate arrangements that resemble archaic scripts or cryptic characters. Ganell explicitly attributes the invention of these figures to Solomon and devotes an entire chapter in his Summa to this kandari. Interestingly, although he does not use the term pentaculum, one of the kandari he presents includes a straightforward pentagram, which he refers to as the pentagonum Solomonis, that is the pentagon of Solomon. For Ganell, these objects are part of a broader magical system. He explains that the kandari are designed to accompany a specific ritual, but they can also be used independently for other aims, depending on the practitioner's needs. In fact, Ganell assigns to each kandari different distinct powers and attributes, treating them as visual embodiments of different, what he calls Shem HaMeforash. This is the Hebrew for God's ineffable names. For example, on one kandaria he wrote, and I quote, "And the power of this shaped Shem HaMeforash is to give strength so that man fears not his enemy, no serpent, no poisons." By treating them as figures representing a divine name, Ganell knowingly poked the theological bear that William had been trying to keep at bay. These illegible signs, Ganell insisted, are indeed communicative forms. Ganell doesn't just describe what the kandaria do. He explains how they are to be made. 10 kandaria in total, arranged in 5 pairs. Each pair is to be inscribed on a separate metal tablet, 5 in all. The metals prescribed are silver, lead, or tin, depending on what the magician can afford. It's not entirely clear whether the 2 kandaria of each pair are meant to be engraved on opposite sides of the same tablet or side by side, but Ganell's instruction to draw 2 circles on each tablet suggests that they were intended to appear on the same side. He then goes on to explain how the names of Adonai should be written or painted within each kandaria. As we already mentioned, Ganell thought about the kandaria as visual embodiments of the Shem HaMeforash. Thus, the names of Adonai does not refer to the actual name Adonai. As he sees it, these are not simply literal names to be copied down, but rather figures or configurations that visually represent divine names or forms of the Shem HaMeforash. In Ganell's system, then, the divine is not only heard or spoken, it is drawn. The kandaria are sacred signs that carry power through the visual structure. In Ganell's design of the kandaria, a design that likely includes his own creative input, it is easy to spot how distinct letters and symbols are woven together, almost in the manner of royal monograms. This is no coincidence. Ganell clearly wanted his readers to understand the kandaria as visual representations of divine names. To make that point clear, he emphasized that these figures were composed of actual letters, not just abstract marks. For example, in the instruction for crafting the second kandaria on the first metal tablet, the practitioner is told to, and I quote, "And you will place in its center O, and in the eastern part of this figure, namely the letter P, with 2 intersected lines. Thus," and then there is a draw of this P with 2 intersected lines, "such that it holds the tail over that O or Otho. And in the southern part, place such a iota that holds the foot over the O of the center. And at the head of this iota, on the side turning towards the east, you will put this Hebrew letter Lamed. And in the western part, you will place a long iota again. And at its summit, the Greek psi. And in the northern part, another long iota, up to the center, and at its head, put the letter psi. And the power of this character is that on the day anyone sees it, he will be freed from all evil." In this particular example, Ganell explicitly draws on the alphabets of 3 languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, to construct the kandaria. This multilingual layering is central to his vision of magical writing. The kandaria is not merely a symbol, but a composite name. In the accompanying illustration, Ganell also includes the names of the 4 cardinal directions. There is Ori for east, Merit for south, Oxy for west, and Septo for north. These directional markers likely serve a practical purpose, helping the practitioner properly orient the kandari during its creation, ensuring that each letter or symbol is placed in its correct position relative to the whole. But there may be more to it. The inclusion of the directions could also hint at a secret layer of meaning, one that Ganell chose not to explain. It might even point to a ritual action or specific performance embedded in the process, something that is not made explicit in the Summa, but would have been understood by experienced practitioners. While Ganell emphasized the connection between these visual designs and the divine names they are meant to represent, stressing that the kandari are constructed from actual letters, this does not mean that every figure forms a legible word. In fact, while some may prompt the viewer to interpret them as text or recall specific prayers, others remain obscure. In Ganell's worldview, however, that doesn't make them any less powerful. For him, the letters themselves, regardless of whether they form recognizable words, carry inherent force. What stands out in Ganell's approach is his participation in a much older tradition which the historian Ildar Garibcanov has coined a monogrammatic tradition, which goes back to the late antiquity. This treated monograms not only as signs of personal or political authority, but also as symbols of the divine. In particular, abbreviated or stylized forms of sacred names. Striking examples come from a medieval gold or silver Byzantine reliquary pendant, most probably suspended on the neck for apotropaic purposes. Here, monogram-like forms are used not just to convey authority, but to protect the carrier. In this light, Ganell's kandari, with their letter-based yet often unpronounceable monograms, are not an innovation ex nihilo, but rather a continuation, indeed a revival maybe, of this visual sacred tradition. As we've seen, it was during the late 14th century that kandari were first integrated into the earliest known versions of the clavicula Solomonis. Interestingly, some of the manuscripts that preserve a version of the clavicula also present this kandari as part of a separate and more focused treatise titled De Novem Candaria, on the 9 Kandari. This work clearly outlines their use in a variety of ritual and magical practices, and it may well be the very text that William of Auvergne had in mind when he condemned the kandari in his 13th century writings. In one 15th century Latin manuscript of the clavicula, and likewise in some later Hebrew versions, scribes copied the text on the 9 kandari as an independent text, describing it as follows, and I quote, "It must be known that the written kandari are 9 celestial ones, revealed by divine revelation for the protection of one's own body and soul, revealed to Solomon, and it is effective for many things." Like many other popular practices that found their way into the clavicula Solomonis, the kandari circulated in multiple versions and were often used as textual amulets. These magical figures, labeled kandari by Ganell and later authors, belong to a broader and older tradition of ritual symbols. In fact, they share a lineage with earlier magical diagrams and figures and protective texts. Scholars like Sophie Page, Jean-Patrick Boudet, and Jean-Pierre Decaux have demonstrated that the breve, textual amulets that first appeared in the 11th century and were commonly worn for apotropaic uses, illustrate the blending of two distinct magical spheres, the apotropaic or protective magic, and the demonic or nigromantic magic. The kandaria, in that sense, sit at the intersection of these traditions. They are both protective seals and instruments for commanding spirits or demons, and their dual function reflects the porous boundaries between different strands of magical practice in the medieval world. Indeed, the visual resemblance between breve and common kandaria is clear. Ganell's Summa is one of the earliest surviving sources that shows how textual amulets were brought into the realm of demonic magic, where each kandaria retained its individual power while becoming part of a ritual aimed at summoning demons. This same breve also influenced the clavicula Solomonis, which was created as an auxiliary manual by compiling familiar practices circulating at the time. The use of textual amulets is just one example of these borrowings, which were adopted and integrated into a coherent system of magic. Interestingly, not all pentacles or kandaria in the clavicula Solomonis preserve the features of earlier breve to the same extent. Take, for example, one of the 4 kandaria in the Italian clavicula that features the well-known Sator Arepo square at its center. As Sophie Page has noted, a similar design appears on a loose leaf in an Italian manuscript, offering themes and theological material for Christian feast day sermons. Though the two may not have been created with the same degree of ritual intent, they share key elements, a Sator Arepo square at the center surrounded by explanatory text. In the clavicula, the inscription reads, and I quote, "This name saves from fear and terror." On the manuscript leaf, the text reads, "This is effective in helping people from fear and terror, Berachiel." The addition of the angel Berachiel, known in some traditions for his power to protect against sudden death, seems to amplify the amulet's protective function. In other examples, this same figure is associated with assisting women during childbirth, further showing how flexible and widely adaptable these textual designs could be. Since demonic magic was widely regarded as dangerous, even for experienced practitioners, it's not surprising that apotropaic protective measures were built into its rituals. Many texts that deal with spirit summoning stress that fear itself can be deadly, warning that demons often try to overwhelm the magician with terror as a means of escape or attack. In this light, a kandaria that saves from fear and terror makes perfect sense. This helps explain the formula recited by magicians when presenting the pentacles to the summoned demons. And they say to them, "Here are the signs and names of the Creator, which you, the demons, always fear." Here, fear, the very weapon used by demons, is turned against them. Yet some Latin manuscripts of the clavicula preserve the idea that each of the kandariae could be used on its own, without any connection with summoning demons. This is the case in a 16th century manuscript from Ghent, which reproduces the full series of kandariae, or pentacles, found in the earlier Italian version, though with a few modifications. Most notable among them are the inclusion of a smaller pentacle, consisting only of the central element from the Italian version, and the addition of brief caption beneath each kandaria. For example, the kandaria we discussed earlier from Ganell's Summa, the one he described as having the power that on the day anyone sees it, he will be freed from all evil, also appears in this 16th century clavicula. Beneath it, the caption reads, and I quote, "Carry this with you so that you may not be hindered by anyone." Unlike the clavicula, Ganell though clearly familiar with the term pentaculum, which he uses elsewhere in his Summa, does not identify the kandari with it. It is the clavicula that gives us the earliest clear example of this identification, suggesting that the link between the two terms, the pentacles and kandari, emerged in the late 14th century, likely introduced by the authors of the clavicula. In their effort to organize and standardize a range of magical traditions, these authors sometimes blurred distinctions between terms. The identification of pentacles with kandari was further reinforced in the early 16th century by the German Benedictine abbot Johannes Trithemius. In one of his books, where he lists forbidden books, Trithemius refers to a book of the Pentacles of Solomon, which he claims contains demonic conjuration and kandarias. That's what he called it. Based on the incipit of the text, Trithemius cites, it appears to have been a fairly standard manual for making pentacles, likely drawing on passages from the Clavicula Solomonis. Yet, not everyone accepted this blending of terms or the broadening of the category. Already in the early 16th century, some thinkers voiced concerns about what they saw as a dilution or even corruption of meaning. The term pentacle was increasingly used for a wide range of figures and no longer aligned with what some consider the true or authentic meaning of the term. A clear example of this critique comes from Celio Calcanini, an Italian astronomer at the court of Ferrara. In his writing, he recounts a typical story of how magicians, through misuse or misunderstanding, corrupted the once noble sign. In a letter to his nephew, Thomas Calcanini, Celio tells the story of the sign of the Greek king Antiochus Soter, essentially a pentagram, used as a military insignia to protect Antiochus' troops. The pentagram, marked with the Greek word for health, was illustrated by the printer of this letter, and you can see it on the screen. Calcanini refers to this figure as both pentagram and pentagon, noting that it gained widespread recognition and a strong reputation. It was then, he explained, that some magi or magicians adopted the figure for their demonic magical practices. Through this brief historical reflection, Calcanini arrives at the letter's closing remark, and I quote, "From here, the name of pentacles became commonly known, corrupted as it is often the case with words, because pentagons of 5 prominent angles should not be called pentacles." Making a clear distinction between the commonly known term pentacles, which he considered a corruption of pentagons, Calcanini also points to something that is far beyond the corrupted word. People began to confuse the magician's pentacles with the ancient apotropaic sign of Antiochus. Or more precisely, they came to believe that the magical pentacles carried the same protective power, an attribution Calcanini sees as both erroneous and symptomatic of broader magical misappropriation. The connection between the sign of Antiochus and pentacles was later taken up by the English physician Richard Argentine in his 1568 treatise on the illusions and incantations of demons and necromancers. Building on earlier thinkers like Calcanini, Argentine argues that the pentacle is not only a corrupted term when used interchangeably with the sign of Antiochus, but that it also came to represent something far more sinister, an infernal symbol. While the sign of Antiochus was a military emblem meant to protect, Argentine claims that the pentacles had by then became associated with demonic forces, even appearing on the banners of the last line of troops of Tartarus, right, of the demons of hell. Given that his work is focused on demonic and necromantic practices, it is no surprise that he treats this shift not just as a linguistic error, but as a sign of deeper corruption, where an originally protective sign had been misappropriated by contemporary practitioners aligned, in his view, with the powers of darkness. In this lecture, we trace the emergence of the pentacle as the new seal of Solomon within late medieval and early modern European magic. We examined how the clavicula Solomonis played a central role in identifying pentacles with the older kandari, integrating earlier protective figures, often used as textual amulets, into a structured ritual system aimed at summoning and condemning demons. We explored how these figures were not only visual representation of divine names, but also inherited the legacy of monogrammatic traditions from late antiquity. Over time, the terminology blurred, leading to both systematization and confusion, as seen in the writings of Tritemius, Calcagnini, and Argentine, each reacting to what they perceived as the misuse or corruption of sacred symbols. The history of the pentacle, then, reveals not only visual evolution, but also a deeper contest over meaning, authority, and the boundaries between licit and illicit magic. But why did figures like Argentine, a physician, even bother? Why did Calcagnini take the time to write about this so-called corruption? His complaint that pentacles had become commonly known, vulgar, right, points us towards a broader cultural shift and serve as a hint for our next lecture. There we will explore how pentacles moved beyond the confines of ritual magic literature and entered more mainstream spaces. We will examine how the term itself became useful not only for negromancers, those demon summoners, but also for physicians. In our next lecture, we'll follow this diffusion more closely. We'll explore how Solomon's seals in the form of pentacles move beyond this demonic magic realm and into popular literature, medicine, natural science, and, no less importantly, into the streets. Drawing on inquisitorial records, medical case studies, and the writings of early modern physicians or medical practitioners, we'll examine how pentacles were transformed yet again from ritual instruments of coercion into healing amulets and everyday tools of protection embraced by a much broader public. Thank you.